Hey everybody, I'm super excited because we're going to be talking about digital cameras today. We're going to break it down to a very beginner level, but also talk about some advanced features in different types of digital cameras with an emphasis on bird photography. So although I've been using digital cameras for a while, I really got into using these bigger, more professional ones in the last year, maybe year and a half. And so let's start by talking about the different types of cameras and which ones are actually best for birding. So let's start with the compact cameras. And I kind of grew up using these and the other ones that you would take the picture and you'd have to get it developed. You'd take it to like a Walgreens, they would develop the film, then you got the little envelope and you could look through all the pictures. So these are basically just point and shoot. So you would turn it on, you might have a little bit of zoom, you'd press the button down maybe halfway to focus, then take your picture. And with the digital versions, then you could just plug it into the computer and get your pictures. But these don't really have much of a zoom. The quality compared to what we have now isn't great. At the time, it may have been really good. So these little compact cameras, although they're fun and you can take pictures of stuff if it's super close, if you're taking images and videos of small birds, it's really not going to do too much for you. Moving on, we have the bridge cameras. And this is a camera that I've been using for over 10 years now, I think. This is the Panasonic Lumix FZ80. It's a super zoom camera. And so basically you turn it on and it has this huge zoom capability. And you can treat it like a point and shoot if you just put it on auto mode, but you can also change some of the settings. And what I love about this camera is that it's really light. So it's great for someone who's just a beginner because you can operate it like a point and shoot and has really good video stabilization. So this isn't going to be too heavy for like a kid or someone who's just starting out or someone who's older and doesn't want the extra weight. So with this, I've got some awesome pictures, but I did a full review on this camera if you want to check it out. And even though I do have some other options, I will still use this camera for stuff, and it really does get the job done, and I think it's great for birding. Another bridge camera people like is the Nikon P1000. And the thing about that one is it's also a super zoom. It's a little heavier, and some of the older birders I've talked to, they don't like that extra weight. It's a lot on their neck. And so the thing about it is when it zooms too, I feel like it then tilts forward. So it's hard to balance, the weight of that. But I think these are great for beginners or just if you want something quick to take along that's light and it's not going to be too crazy. I do think you reach kind of a max capability with this. And when you move on to some of these more professional setups, you can get higher quality images more easily. Your ratio, I feel like, goes up of keepers to ones that you're gonna put in the trash. But yeah, great overall, love the bridge cameras and pretty affordable too. Our next category is DSLRs, and I'm actually using mine to film right now, so I can't show you in hand, but DSLR stands for Digital Single Lens Reflex. So basically it uses a mirror to make the picture go into the viewfinder, and so when you actually click your photo, that has to flip up so the picture gets to the sensor. And so you'd have the noise when you would take the picture. And there's some fantastic DSLR cameras out there. Now they've kind of switched to another tier of cameras called mirrorless. So you can get some of the DSLR cameras that are really, really high quality for a much more affordable price. So if you'd been eyeing one before, you can probably get a pretty good deal on it now. Canon and Nikon are two of the big brands that I've always heard about for good DSLR cameras. But the photography community has kind of moved on to the next branch of cameras called the mirrorless cameras. So this was a lot of breakthrough technology, and basically it just doesn't have that mirror that flips up and down. And so the light and the image is just going straight to the sensor. So you can actually shoot silently with mirrorless setups. But this has kind of revolutionized the photography game. Some of the big players with the mirrorless cameras are Canon, Nikon, Sony, Panasonic, and then Olympus, which has rebranded to OM System cameras. So I tested a bunch of different mirrorless cameras because I wanted to have them in hand to be able to see everything myself. I liked looking at stuff online, but I didn't feel like it really gave me the in-the-hand experience that I was looking for. So there's a site called Lens Rentals where you can actually order this stuff to try for a little bit. So you can do different bodies and lenses, and then you have it for a little bit, you can use it, then you package it up and send it back. It is a little bit expensive, but I found that it has actually been cheaper than going to a local photography store and trying it out. When you're moving into this gear that's more expensive, I think it's crucial to have it in hand to actually see what you're getting and see what you're able to do with it before you actually invest in it, because it is quite pricey. So I would recommend either lens rentals or a local store, maybe see what's cheaper, but definitely try it out before you buy it. Some of the perks with mirrorless cameras is they're a little bit lighter and the autofocus is much better. So some of these cameras will even have a bird's eye autofocus specifically. Some have animal, some have the bird's eye. That's one thing I really like about the OM1 cameras is they have a specific bird's eye autofocus that locks onto the eye of the bird to keep the face sharp. And it's also important to note that there's different types of sensors on these cameras. So if you have a full frame camera that's kind of seen as like the super professional model, as people will want full frame because it's not cropping your image at all. There's other sensors that will actually crop it when you're looking at it. So with OM, it's a 2x crop. So when you're looking through, you're actually zoomed in 2 times basically already. With some other cameras, it might be like a 1.5 times crop, but essentially it's just cropping it for you already based on the size of the sensor. And so it does limit you a little bit. If you may not have wanted to crop that image as much, you don't really have that option. And then since it's a little more zoomed in, you might have a little more graininess, but I haven't found it to be too much of an issue. Also with the bridge cameras, there's no lens to detach. So basically it just, zooms out. You're not able to take anything off. That is a bonus of the DSLRs and mirrorless systems is you can detach the lenses and then put something else on so you have a different range. But one thing that's a little bit different is with the bridge cameras and the point and shoot compact cameras, most of the time they're talking about like 60x, like that's your zoom. With this stuff, it's talked about in millimeters. So you kind of have to get a gauge for what a 300 millimeter lens is going to be able to do versus a 600 millimeter lens. I think for bird photography and videography, if you're photographing really small birds, you want at least a 600 millimeter or a 600 millimeter equivalent. Now I say equivalent because with the 2x of the OM system camera here, the OM1 Mark II, it is turning basically what would be a 300 millimeter lens or whatever lens you have on and doubling your ability to see because of that 2x crop. So this is their 150 to 600 millimeter lens, and it is a 300 to 1200 millimeter equivalent. So that, in my opinion, is a big bonus of actually having that crop factor. And I've really enjoyed that extra distance because I was so used to the super zoom that anything that was full frame seemed so far away when I was looking at birds. So that is actually a big bonus, in my opinion, to the crop sensor. And sometimes I actually use this camera just to bird. Now, some of the other cameras that I've tried was the Sony a7 IV, which I really enjoyed. I also tried the Sony a7R5. And with those, the R series is more geared towards photography, and the a7 IV was supposed to be a hybrid, so it was taking photo and video. I thought it was great, really enjoyed using it, but then I started using the OM stuff and got used to being so close, and so I feel like I would kind of miss that going to a full frame. I also tried the Canon R5. That's a really popular one. I've seen some people take some amazing images with that. I think it was with their 100 to 500 millimeter lens. That's a great combination. You can do so much with it. They made the R5 II now, so the R5 may be coming down in price. And then Nikon, the Nikon Z8 and Z9 are really great. And then Sony's flagship is the Sony A1. That's even a level above the a7 IV that I was talking about. But with some of these, the price just gets so high that it's kind of in another realm. So I think you can do pretty well with not necessarily those flagship products. And I'm sure as we go on, they'll make new ones, and then the ones you're looking at now are going to come down in price at some point. But in my research, people have actually said that they think the lens is more important. So if you get a really good lens, you're going to have that even if the body changes. So if you have a really nice Sony lens, I like the Sony 200 to 600 a lot, then you can get the upgraded body and still use that lens. So the lens is really important for the quality of your images. Now, I think it was about last year when OM System offered to send me some of their gear to test out. So I was using the OM1, and I had their 300 millimeter lens, and then I tried their 150 to 400 millimeter Pro lens. That was kind of my first foray into doing this. This was before I tested any of the other cameras out. And I was amazed at how much this mirrorless stuff is like point and shoot. If you put it on auto, you can pretty much just start clicking and get some incredible photographs. So I was kind of blown away by that. And then I got to try the OM1 Mark II with the 150 to 600 millimeter lens. I do like the extra reach a lot. The only downside is lenses can be a little bit heavy. So this is pretty heavy. You may want to get like a camera carrying system, like they have the cotton carriers, so you can have it held up like this when you're out. And then this barrel does slide down sometimes, so you just gotta lock it in place. But on the lenses too, there's a lot that you can do, such as setting the autofocus or manual focus on here, and then turning stabilization on or off. So this actually helps stabilize a lot. And if you just do a little bit of post-processing, just add a little stabilization, it makes it pretty good just being handheld. You can use a tripod if you want to be a little bit more stable. So now that we've talked about some of the different cameras you can get, let's talk about how to compose your photo. So you may have seen these different letters on here, and we're going to focus on just a few of them. You have manual mode, where basically you control everything. Shutter priority, you control the shutter speed and the camera automatically adjusts everything else. Aperture priority, where you control the aperture and the camera adjusts everything else. And then program, which is the camera is selecting aperture and shutter speed, and you can adjust other settings. There's also the movie mode on here if you're taking videos, and then some other custom settings you can set. So if you have something maybe for birds in flight, then you can set that, go to custom, and then you're ready to go right away. So in order to understand these different modes, we need to talk about the exposure triangle. And getting the right exposure for your photo is really important. So that's just making sure that it's not too bright or it's not too dark. So while I was doing research for this, I found a site online called Capture the Atlas, and they had some really great graphics and a really awesome explanation for the exposure triangle. So they were nice enough to let me use these in the video. So we're gonna take a look, and you can check out their site. I'll put a link in the description, and they also have their own YouTube channel if you wanna check it out. So the exposure triangle is balancing your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to get the perfect composition of lighting. So the first side of the exposure triangle is going to be aperture. So that's basically just how wide the lens is open. So if it's more open, it's going to let in more light. If it's more closed, it's going to let in less light. So you'll see the different F numbers, and we'll talk about that in a second. But basically with this graphic, I just want you to look at, if it's more closed, it's gonna be less bright, and if it's more open, you're gonna get more light. So that's basically all aperture is how open or closed your lens is, how much light it's bringing in. So in addition to the aperture affecting how much light it's bringing in, it's also gonna affect the depth of field. So if that aperture is more open, you're gonna have more background blur, which is known as bokeh. So sometimes people like having a bird or something in the foreground and then the background more blurred out. So you're gonna get more bokeh or background blur having that aperture more open. When it's more closed, you're gonna have more things in focus at the same time. So it's a greater depth of field. So depending on what you want, you may want more blur or less blur. Now we'll move on to shutter speed, which I find is the most important one, in my opinion, for bird photography. Some people like doing all the settings themselves, but normally I feel like I'm pretty good with setting it on shutter priority and letting the camera do the other settings. But a rule for this is you want your minimum shutter speed to freeze the action to be 1 over the max length of your lens, and that includes the crop factor. So if this was not a crop sensor, you'd want a minimum of 1 over 600 to freeze the action. Since it's a crop sensor, it's a 1200 millimeter equivalent, so you want a minimum of 1 over 1200. And for birds in flight, sometimes I'll go even higher. It kind of depends on how much natural light there is around. If there's natural light, you can use a lower shutter speed and not have as many adverse effects as you would if it was super overcast. But essentially, if you have a higher shutter speed, it's only open for a fraction of a second, so that is gonna let in less light. So normally your photos are gonna be darker the higher your shutter speed is. The more you lower your shutter speed, the more light is gonna go into that photo. And this has a big effect on motion. So if that shutter speed is slower, you're gonna see more blur. And normally you don't want that, especially with birds in flight. So if you're taking images of a perched bird, you might be able to get away with a lower shutter speed compared to trying to take images of a bird in flight, where you might wanna bump it up a little bit. So you may wanna have a custom setting for birds in flight and then perched birds. The third side of the exposure triangle is ISO. And when I started learning about this, I'm like, what is ISO? I don't even know what any of this stuff means. Isos is a Greek word meaning equal. So this is kind of the camera adjusting how much light it's letting in. So if your ISO is higher, generally things are gonna be brighter. And if your ISO is lower, things are gonna be a little more dark. Now, I wish it was that simple, but unfortunately, as you get to higher ISO, you'll get more digital noise. And so things will start to look more grainy. So if you ever taken a picture when the light is fading and you take it and it looks good, but then you blow it up on the computer and it's really grainy, that ISO was probably up pretty high. So you can't change one of these three things without affecting the others if you want a good exposure. So that's what's nice about some of the settings where the camera sets it for you. If you have, I want my shutter speed to be this, the camera goes, okay, I'll adjust everything else to make up for it. So let's talk about those f-stops that we mentioned earlier. So basically a stop in photography is a way of measuring how much light is going in. And if you increase one f-stop, then you're doubling the amount of light. If you decrease one, then you're halving the amount of light. So essentially, if you took your shutter speed down from 1/2000 to 1/1000, you're increasing one stop. Therefore, your amount of light is double what it was. So essentially, the f-stop has to do with the aperture as well. And some lenses will tell you what the f-stop values are if it's a zoom lens like these. Other times there are prime lenses, which means it's a fixed focal length. So you could get a 600mm prime lens. You couldn't zoom in and out with it. It would just be fixed. Those are sharper normally, but they're also very, very expensive. So with something like that, you may have a fixed f-stop value. So essentially what all this means is you're trying to balance those factors. So if you're in manual mode, you're gonna have to adjust these things yourself. If you're in shutter priority, you set that, camera adjust for everything else. If you're in aperture, you set that, camera adjust for everything else. So for me, I like shooting in shutter priority because freezing the action is important with birds, but you can kind of do this however you want. But feel free to play with the different settings, see what you like, see what you don't like, and kind of take your own spin on it. Another thing to think about is what mode you're shooting in. So if you shoot in JPEG mode, you basically just take a picture and that is your picture. You can also shoot in something called RAW, which takes up more space, but it allows you to do more in post-processing. Normally the file sizes are larger, so you're gonna be doing a bunch of editing. You'll probably wanna shoot in RAW and then you can do the editing later and then save it. But if you're a beginner and you're not planning on getting huge prints of your photos, you're just kind of doing it for fun, you may post them online, share them with your friends, normally JPEG is pretty good. Some people probably gonna roast me for that because they're purists or they don't think JPEG is good enough, but it really depends on what you're wanting to do. So I normally still shoot in JPEG, I take a lot of videos, and then my files aren't huge. And if you do end up with things that are a little bit grainy, you can use some post-processing programs. There's one called Topaz Photo AI. I'll put a link in the description, but it's pretty wild how much grain you can clear up and how much you can sharpen a photo. So another thing I want to mention is if you see people's photos online, there's probably been a degree of editing. Be easy on yourself. It's complicated. It's a lot to learn. Go at your own pace and make sure you're enjoying yourself. Now let's talk about some tips for bird photography specifically. As I mentioned earlier, I feel like you're gonna want a lens that goes to at least 600mm for those small birds. Anything other than that, I just felt like I was really far away. And also I love having the 1200mm equivalent with this one for birds. It just feels like you can get so much closer and it's more satisfying to work with, even if you do have that 2x crop to kind of deal with, which may be good or bad depending on what you're doing. But one of the things you're gonna wanna do for bird photography is get on the bird's level. And I feel like this is just such a game-changing tip because if you're shooting birds from above, you kind of get the top of the bird and, you know, a weird angle that you wouldn't normally get just looking at a bird. When you go down to the bird's level, sometimes I'll actually lay down, so do that carefully. And then I'll shoot really low on the ground and it just feels like you're in the bird's element then. Feels like you're in part of their world. Another thing is you're gonna wanna shoot when the lighting is the best, which is normally right as the sun comes up and then right as the sun is going down. It's kind of the golden hour times. Midday is normally kind of your worst. You wanna make sure there's good light. I know some photographers, they don't even go out if there's bad light. They're just like, it's not even worth it. I'm not gonna get what I want, so they don't even try. But yeah, you wanna make sure that you're getting up early enough and hitting those times when the lighting is the best. Another thing is using a high shutter speed, so making sure you're actually able to freeze the action on the birds that you're taking images of. You also want to make sure that you're knowing the bird's behavior. So sometimes birds do particular patterns that you can hone in on, or some people actually put sticks up like in their backyard feeder to have a more natural perch, so they'll have the birds land on that before going to the feeder and then it looks like they're in more natural habitat. But you can kind of gauge what a bird's going to do. Like if a duck is bathing, you know it's gonna flap and brush all that water off. So you can kind of wait for that moment. So knowing the bird's behavior helps a lot. You can also shoot in burst mode, so you can take a bunch of pictures in succession. And then systems like the OM1, they actually have a pro capture mode. So if you're waiting for a bird to take off, you can actually press half press the button, it'll start taking pictures basically before you actually officially press the button. So it's kind of a safety device for, let me make sure that I'm capturing this image. One more thing I want to mention about composition is the rule of thirds. So that's essentially if you have your horizontal photo capture window, you separate into 3 boxes on the top, 3 in the middle, 3 in the bottom. You generally want your eyes, so if it's like your bird's eye, to match up with any of those intersection points, and then for things to follow the line. So if you had a bird perched on a stick, maybe its eye is in that top left intersection, and then maybe the branch kind of goes out along that line. Learning about that in composition can help too, where you're leaving enough room where the bird's looking. I remember I would enter photography contests when I was younger, and that was one of the things they mentioned. I had a picture of a chickadee and I centered it in the middle. And they were saying it'd be nice to know where the bird's looking so you can kind of follow that line of sight. It feels like it adds more tension if you cut it off right here and the bird's beak is right there. And I would suggest going out and taking pictures of just the birds that you have around. So things that come to your feeder, chickadees, cardinals, maybe go down to the local pond, take pictures of some ducks, shoot some video, see how it goes, and just start having fun with it. Once you can really learn your system, that's when you're gonna be at your best. I feel like the hardest thing is just kind of making a decision, trying to find the best thing for you, the best price, the ergonomics of it. Some people don't like how some cameras feel, which is also why I think testing it out is super important, having it in the hand and actually just shooting and seeing how it works for you. So I hope you found this video helpful. Photography is so much fun. There's also a lot of great YouTube channels that talk about bird photography, and we have a couple videos as well. We're hoping to do some more. We did a whole video with Dwayne Patton, who's got an awesome photography channel. You can check that out. I also have reviews to some of the cameras, such as the OM1 Mark II. I'm planning on reviewing the others, just haven't got around to it yet, like making the full videos about them. But let me know what your most important tip that you learned about bird photography was in the comments below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Badgerland Birding.